Hey team, um, I don't know when I'm uploading this, but it's December 21st, 2023. Um, so either uh, I don't know if I don't know when I'll put this up, but uh, Happy New Year, and hope you had a fine holiday time. I'm sick right now, so this might not sound terribly good. Um, Not that the other ones do sound terribly good when I'm not sick, but here we are. This is a piece titled "The Communist Opposition: From Brest-Litovsk to the 10th Party Congress" by Robert V. Daniels. Um, Robert V. Daniels wrote a famous book called "The Conscience of the Revolution: The Communist Opposition in Soviet Russia." And I started reading that for this channel, but and for my own purposes. But it was just too much. I was dividing myself between too many books at once, so I kind of just abandoned it. But I would like to, know more about what Robert V. Daniels has to say. So I'm just going to try to read some essays. I'm gonna try to focus on essays and articles for this channel from now on. I feel like it's gives them more of a diverse flavor of thought and less committal. Do people really want to listen to like a 6 video uh, audiobook? I don't think so. Not typically. I mean, I do, but that's just me. Okay. Anyway, the Communist Opposition from Brest-Litovsk to the 10th Party Congress. Introduction. A striking feature of the Russian Revolution was the persistence of political pluralism within the victorious Communist Party throughout the most violent and uncertain period of revolutionary struggle, the era of war communism between 1918 and 1921. Though opposition outside the party was suppressed step by step between January and July 1918, internal communist opposition to Lenin's policies continued active and vocal until after the end of the Civil War. This opposition served significantly to document the changing methods and direction of the nascent Soviet regime. The more famous struggle for the succession to Lenin in the 1920s was less free and less profound in the issues it raised than the controversies of the war communism era. Not until General Secretary Mikhail Gorbachev opened the way for political reform in the 1980s was a comparable debate possible over the fundamental principles of the Soviet system. The issue of coalition. Brest-Litovsk and the left communists. Post-revolutionary opposition to the communist leadership can be divided into 3 phases, or 4 if the months immediately following the October Revolution are included. In those early days, opposition came from the right wing of the party, an echo of misgivings about the forcible one-party seizure of power in October 1917. Grigory Zinoviev, Lev Kamenev, and future Prime Minister Alexei Rykov, and others who had resisted the October action actually resigned their seats in the Bolshevik Central Committee and the new Council of People's Commissars on the 4th of November 1917 as they vainly demanded the formation of a multi-party coalition government. The only result of this protest was the temporary inclusion of the Left Socialist Revolutionary Party in the Council of People's Commissars. In January 1918, political lines within the Bolshevik Party were completely recast when Lenin abruptly came out for acceptance of the demands made by Germany in the negotiations at Brest-Litovsk to end Russia's participation in World War I. In this shift, he was now supported by the characteristically cautious right wing of the party, who remained his staunch allies until his death in 1924, but was opposed on the left by Nikolai Bukharin and his followers, who had been the most ardent supporters of the revolutionary takeover and party dictatorship. This realignment set up the ongoing confrontation between Lenin and the left opposition that continued in one form or another until 1921 and had its echoes throughout the 1920s. Bukharin and the opponents of peace in 1918 contended that the agreement with Germany would hamstring revolutionary Russia's mission to spread the socialist revolution internationally, and would thereby sacrifice the opportunity to win the foreign support that they deemed essential for the survival of the proletarian revolution in Russia itself. As Bukharin contended at the Seventh Party Congress on the 7th of March 1918, quote, "The conditions of the peace, reduce to nothing the international significance of the Russian Revolution, The way out, is revolutionary war against German imperialism," end quote. Bukharin and his supporters were prepared to fall back to Siberia and wage guerrilla war against the enemy while appealing to the European workers to overthrow their respective governments and come to the aid of revolutionary Russia. If the Russian Revolution were thrown back upon itself, they feared it would be obliged to compromise with bourgeois elements and turn into a system of state capitalism. Quote, "If the Russian Revolution were overthrown by violence on the part of the bourgeois counter-revolution," end quote, declared the internationalist Karl Radek, quote, it would rise again like a phoenix. If, however, it lost its socialist character and by this disappointed the working masses, this blow would have 10 times more terrible consequences for the future of the Russian and international revolutions," end quote. Denoting themselves as, quote, "left communist," end quote, the Bukharin group mustered 4 votes against Lenin's 5 in the crucial decision by the Bolshevik Central Committee on the 28th of February 1918 to accept Germany's peace terms, while 4 other Central Committee members, following Leon Trotsky's formula, quote, "no war, no peace," end quote, abstained. Lenin's narrow victory, made possible by the split on the left, established the survival of the revolutionary Russian state as the first priority of Soviet foreign policy, and relegated international revolution to the secondary instrumental role that it continued to play throughout the life of the Soviet regime. In their outrage at the peace, the left communists held talks with the left socialist revolutionaries who were equally opposed to the treaty, with the object, legitimate in a democratic state, of removing Lenin as head of the government, forming a new ruling coalition and resuming the war. Though the left communists quickly backed out of the scheme, it was recalled and used against Bukharin when he was sentenced to death in the Moscow trial of 1938, with the new allegation that the opposition had planned to kill Lenin. Following endorsement of the Treaty of Brest-Litovsk by the Seventh Party Congress in March 1918, the left communists, now led by the economist Valerian Obolensky, broadened their oppositional stance to issues of internal policy. In particular, they denounced Lenin's steps to create a new bureaucratic chain of command in government and industry at the expense of the revolutionary philosophy of the Soviets and workers' control touted by Lenin himself in his 1917 tract, State and Revolution. In their short-lived journal, Communist, the left communists warned of, quote, "the deviation of Soviet power and the majority of the party on the ruinous path of petty bourgeois policies," end quote, and threatened that, quote, "the left wing of the party will have to stand in the position of an effective and responsible proletarian opposition," end quote. The military opposition and the democratic centralists. Upon the outbreak of civil war in May 1918, the Communist Revolution took a sharp turn to the left, with increased repression against all remaining non-communist parties, sweeping nationalization of private enterprise, and forcible requisitioning of food from the peasantry. Viewing the Civil War as a fight for the immediate implementation of the utopian communist goal, the left communists temporarily closed ranks with the party majority in a life-and-death struggle for survival. The program adopted by the Communist Party at its 8th Congress in March 1919 embodied the spirit of the left in affirming, quote, proletarian democracy, end quote, suppression of the resistance of the exploiters, end quote, eventually the abolition of state authority, end quote. Nevertheless, after the collapse of Germany in November 1918, eased pressure on the Soviet regime, new disagreements broke out between the leadership of the party and its left-wing elements. At the core of these new controversies was the degree of centralized power and autocratic methods being exercised by Lenin's government. One focus of contention was the new Red Army as Trotsky had set it up, with conventional military command and discipline and the employment of former Tsarist officers, the, quote, military specialist, end quote, or Spezi. This trend was resisted by communists still enamored by the democratized army of 1917 and informal guerrilla tactics. Led by the left communist Vladimir Smirnov, initially with Joseph Stalin's encouragement, this, quote, military opposition, end quote, challenged Lenin and Trotsky at the 8th Party Congress, particularly over the abolition of elected party committees in the army. At a secret session of the Congress, they won over a third of the delegates for their alternative. Soon afterwards, led by Smirnov, Osinski, and Timofei Sapronov, the leftists formed the, quote, Group of Democratic Centralists, end quote. More accurately, democratic anti-centralists, to challenge the whole direction of the communist regime. They questioned Moscow's growing supremacy over the provinces, the primacy of executive organs over the Soviets, and the dominance of party institutions over the government and other institutions at all levels. Defending the egalitarian ideal and the, quote, collegial principle, end quote, of administration by committees, the democratic centralists underscored the excesses of military methods occurring throughout the country and economic system and the trend to hierarchies of individual authority. A particularly strong center of decentralist sentiment, capitalizing on the issue of minority autonomy, was the Ukraine. The issue of the national minorities in the Russian Empire had divided left and right Bolsheviks before the Revolution, with the former, notably Yuri Pyatakov, calling for, quote, proletarian internationalism, end quote, and the latter, including Lenin, endorsing national self-determination. In practice, when the leftists led by Pyatakov and the democratic centralist Andrei Bubnov gained control of the Communist Party in the Ukraine during the Civil War, the positions were reversed. The left advocated decentralization and the right insisted on centralism. In April 1920, Moscow ordered a thorough purge of the elected Ukrainian leadership and put an end to this base of opposition. The, quote, workers' opposition, end quote, and the trade union controversy. By mid-1920, as a communist victory in the Great Civil War appeared assured, the left opposition again became invigorated, both in the form of the democratic centralist and in a new group based on the trade unions that took the name Workers' Opposition, led by Alexander Shliapnikov, the first Bolshevik Commissar of Labor and one of the anti-dictatorship protesters of November 1917. Alexandra Kollontai, the Bolshevik feminist, first Commissar of Social Welfare and a left communist in 1918, and the metalworkers leader, S.P. Medvedev. The workers' opposition harked back to the workers' control movement of 1917 and called for the trade unions to run industry independently of the party. Quote, the organization of the administration of the economy, should, belong to the All-Russian Congress of Producers, united in trade production unions, who elect central organs that administer the whole economy of the republic, end quote. Shliapnikov proposed a three-way, quote, separation of powers, end quote, between the party, the Soviets, and the trade unions, while Kollontai denounced both bourgeois experts and communist bureaucrats and protested, quote, "The working class, as a class, becomes an ever less important factor in the affairs of the Soviet Republic," end quote. The workers' opposition wanted to expel all non-proletarians from the party and require officials to perform manual labor at least 3 months a year. A high point of left opposition sentiment came at the Ninth Party Conference in September 1920, as support for both the democratic centralists and the workers' opposition peaked. Almost half the party members in Moscow supported one or the other or the parallel group led by E.N. Ignatov. The Ninth Conference adopted a remarkable resolution affirming the norms of democracy and free criticism within the party, and calling for steps to cure bureaucracy and eliminate economic inequality. In the autumn and winter of 1920-21, the most decisive controversy yet in the history of the Soviet Republic broke out over the future role of the trade unions in the communist system, and by implication over the prospects and methods for implementing the new society. On the left were the workers' opposition and the democratic centralists, upholding the economic primacy of the trade unions and looking to the rapid realization of the anti-state ideal of 1917. Unfortunately for the left, the old proletarian base of the party had largely dissolved during the Civil War. As industry was idled, workers were drawn into the army and the bureaucracy if they did not simply quit the party and go back to their ancestral villages, and wartime casualties took their toll. Where workers remained politically active, they often preferred the Mensheviks, especially in Petrograd. Meanwhile, just as in the Brest-Litovsk controversy, a fissure opened up between the communist center led by Trotsky and the right wing of the party who rallied around Lenin. The Trotskyists, joined now by Bukharin, believed in the need for maximum coercion in the spirit of war communism to institute the new society. They proceeded from two controversial initiatives of Trotsky's: labor armies and Sekhtran, the Central Committee for Transport, set up in August 1920 to merge the rail and water transport unions with the Commissariat of Communications under military-style party officers. On this model, the centrists called for, quote, governmentalizing, end quote, and militarizing the trade unions in order to absorb the trade unions into the centralized structure of management and discipline. Lenin, however, was moving towards a more cautious and long-term conception of the transition to socialism. First through a so-called, quote, buffer, end quote, group led by Zinoviev, and then directly, he called for the trade unions to revert to their conventional role as defenders of the interest of the workers while management remained the prerogative of the system of, quote, state capitalism, end quote. An acrimonious public debate, the broadest since the Brest-Litovsk controversy, and unmatched again until the Gorbachev era, extended from the 8th Congress of Soviets in December 1920 to the 10th Party Congress in March 1921. However, relying for his base on the Petrograd Party organization controlled by Zinoviev, Lenin was able, as before, to prevail in most party organizations when they chose their delegates to the Congress. Still, Lenin barely came out ahead in the Moscow organization against the combined forces of the left opposition and the Trotskyists. The 10th Party Congress and the suppression of the opposition. All of the issues raised by the left opposition, party democracy, decentralization of power, and the status of the workers and trade unions, were abruptly resolved at the 10th Congress. The Congress happened to coincide with the revolt against communist rule by troops and sailors at the Kronstadt naval base outside Petrograd, whose grievances echoed the complaints of the left opposition. Lenin seized the occasion of this threat as an excuse to suppress his opponents within the party and silence utopian dreams for an early transition to the communist ideal. To this end, he had the Congress adopt two decisive resolutions: one, on the syndicalist and anarchist deviation in our party, condemned the workers' opposition as a, quote, petty bourgeois, end quote, heresy. Foolishly, the democratic centralists broke ranks with the workers' opposition to endorse this excommunication. The second resolution, on party unity, banned further activity or formal platforms by any organized faction within the party. A secret clause authorized the Central Committee by a 2/3 vote to expel any of its own members deemed guilty of factionalism. These moves effectively ended the free exchange of ideas within the party. At the same time that Lenin announced a retreat in this revolution by adopting the new economic policy, compromising with small-scale private enterprise and the peasantry, and relegating the trade unions to the limited role they had under capitalism. Simultaneously, Lenin punished the Trotsky faction by removing them from their strategic position in the party, Secretariat and Central Committee, as Lenin turned to Stalin to be the top organization man under the new rules of party discipline. Lenin and Trotsky remained at odds until the Soviet leaders' last months of activity in 1922 to 1923. The stage was now set for the vocal but ultimately futile effort by former oppositionists throughout the 1920s to deny Stalin the political succession and the fate of the revolution. Echoes of the opposition of the war communism era continued to be heard. In March 1922, the workers' opposition vainly appealed to the Communist International, Comintern, against the suppression of, quote, workers, end quote, quote, workers' democracy, end quote, in Russia. In 1923, one of their number, Gavril Myasnikov, organized a new anti-bureaucratic movement, the, quote, workers' group, end quote, but it was quickly suppressed. The democratic centralists made common cause with the Trotskyists in the, quote, new course, end quote, controversy over party democracy in December 1923 to January 1924, the first in the series of fruitless efforts by the left opposition of the 1920s to reverse the trend towards totalitarianism. They appeared again as a separate group in 1927 to plead for the restoration of democracy in the party, only to be expelled at the same time as the Trotskyists at the 15th Party Congress in December of that year. With few exceptions, the leaders of the 1918 to 21 oppositions were liquidated in the purges of 1936 to 1938, without benefit of trial. An exception was Alexandra Kollontai, who survived to serve as a Soviet diplomat until her death in 1952, 1 year prior to Stalin's death. Background and philosophy of the opposition. The roots of the communist opposition of 1918 to 1921 go well back into the pre-revolutionary history of the Bolshevik movement, especially in the emigration. From the revolution of 1905 onwards, the Bolshevik faction of the Russian Social Democratic Workers' Party was divided over political tactics, as the revolutionary purists, led by Lenin's initial second-in-command, the philosopher-economist Alexander Bogdanov, disputed Lenin's decision to take part in the Tsarist Duma. In 1917, Lenin veered to the left to call for a new revolution by the Bolsheviks, in which he was backed by left Bolsheviks such as Bukharin, together with a group of radical anti-war social democrats around Trotsky, who rallied to support the Bolshevik leader. These elements then became the nucleus of the left opposition to Lenin, as he determined to make peace with Germany and supplant the direct democracy of 1917 with new structures of hierarchical authority. Bogdanov's influence continued to be felt in the movement to create a distinct proletarian culture. Based on the theory that all culture and values are class-bound, this effort was embodied between 1918 and 1921 in the Proletkult organization that Bogdanov headed. Disbanded by the party, Proletkult nevertheless had an echo in the anti-bureaucratic, quote, workers' truth, end quote, organization that surfaced in 1923 to call for a new, quote, workers' party, end quote. Like Myasnikov's workers' group, the workers' truth was quickly broken up by the police. Nevertheless, Bogdanov's doctrines and some of his disciples, including the historian Mikhail Pokrovsky and former democratic centralist Bubnov, as Commissar of Education, were briefly influential in what is often termed Stalin's, quote, cultural revolution, end quote, of 1928 to 1932. In terms of personal background, a disproportionate number of the left opposition leaders were connected with experience in the pre-revolutionary emigration. Lenin, an émigré himself, used these people in 1917 to press his own radical agenda, but subsequently he always managed to overcome them by appealing to members from the pre-revolutionary Russian underground, usually workers, who had risen to the lower and middle levels of the post-revolutionary party bureaucracy. Typically impatient with theoretical disputations and democratic challenges to their own status, these apparatchniki provided the authoritarian nucleus for Stalin's rise to dominance in the party and the destruction of all opposition groups. A consistent set of ideas grounded in the émigré experience ran from one manifestation of the left opposition to the next. They were semi-anarchist utopians, with an unbounded faith in the workers. They were anti-intellectual intellectuals or semi-intellectuals, particularly when it came to the employment of the, quote, technical intelligentsia, end quote, in positions of authority over the workers. This theme was temporarily revived by Stalin with his anti-expert show trials during the upheaval of 1928 to 32. The oppositionists were internationalist and messianic about the impact of the Russian Revolution on the rest of the world, an impulse that mobilized them behind Lenin's drive for power in 1917 and just as emphatically turned them against Lenin in 1918. The left opposition believed ardently in the process of democracy and political pluralism, but only for the working class, and after November 1917, within the framework of the single, quote, proletarian, end quote, party, a fatal imitation as it turned out. They recognized from an early moment the drift of the new Soviet system away from the direct democracy and egalitarianism of 1917, and towards bureaucratic authoritarianism, in the dominance of the party over the state, i.e., the elected Soviets, of the center over local authority, and of individuals over the committees and other elected bodies that were supposed to serve. They returned again and again to the principle of the direct participation of the masses in administering their own destiny. In government, in the military, and in industrial relations. They disliked the money economy as a survival of capitalism, and looked forward to an egalitarian, quote, natural economy, end quote, under communism. On the other hand, they had little interest in the peasantry and made little of the potential issue of rural suffering. In failing, they nevertheless created a record of protest documenting the evolution of the system, at least politically and in the urban sector, away from the utopianism of 1917. The failure of the opposition. Many factors contributed to the failure of the left opposition of 1918 to 1921. The small Russian working class on which the opposition intended to rely was dissipated by the conditions of war communism. The opposition's anti-bureaucratic and anti-expert philosophy ran directly counter to the technology-based requirements of modern life, and moreover defied the centralist habits of the Russian political tradition. Outside of Moscow and a few provincial centers, the opposition had no significant social base. It was usually divided, as it was between the Trotsky and Bukharin factions in the Brest-Litovsk controversy, and between the democratic centralists, the workers' opposition, and the Trotskyists in 1920 to 1921. It lacked strong leaders able to stand up effectively to Lenin. Trotsky had the necessary charisma, but he was inclined to authoritarianism himself, and vacillated at key moments. The oppositionists were personally honest and dedicated individuals who protested at Lenin's authoritarianism within the communist regime. Unfortunately, bewitched by the mythology of the dictatorship of the proletariat, they failed, with few exceptions, to challenge the communist monopoly of power or to question the terror tactics used against non-communists, until they fell victim themselves when the one-party system was constricted into a one-faction system and then into a one-man system. What if the left opposition had in fact succeeded at some point in checking the rush of the communist regime towards ruthless authoritarianism? Would their idealism and naivety have exposed them to the revenge of the counter-revolution? Or would their fervor have carried them into the same sort of centralist expedience that the communist leadership in fact accepted? In any case, success for the utopians would have been contrary to all historical precedent. The one-party dictatorship and the requirements of political survival in a society racked by revolution and civil war reduced the anarchistic aspirations of the left to a misty dream. Previous and subsequent parallels. For the communist opposition of 1918 to 1921 to be fully understood, it has to be placed in the context of other great revolutions of history and the characteristic unfolding of the revolutionary process. Revolutions typically move from a moderate liberal phase in Russia, the provincial government of 1917, to a radical extremist phase, the Bolshevik dictatorship, before they retreat and evolve into totalitarian dictatorship, the new economic policy, and then Stalinism. Within the extremist phase, there is another characteristic development, the emergence of a utopian ultra-radical tendency in opposition to the more pragmatic radicals in power. Such were the Levelers and the Fifth Monarchy men in the English Revolution of the 17th century, democratic visionaries and religious millenarians respectively, and the French revolutionary factions known as the Enragés and the Hébertistes, advocates for the Parisian working class, along with proto-communist Gracchus Babeuf and his, quote, conspiracy of the equals, end quote. Similarly, the sequence of opposition efforts in Russia from the left communists to the workers' opposition represented the force of utopian purism ranged against the perceived abuses of power and sacrifices of principle by the revolutionary government. In Russia, as in the earlier instances, the ultra-radicals inevitably failed, but their stance established a new benchmark for subsequent revolutionary experiments elsewhere. The anti-bureaucratic, anti-expert, and egalitarian sentiments of the Russian left opposition briefly stirred up a current of sympathy in the new communist parties in Europe, though it was denounced by Lenin as a, quote, childhood disease of left communism, end quote. Yugoslav communism after 1948 revived the Russian anti-statist ideas of 1917, and Josip Broz Tito's program of, quote, worker self-management, end quote, bore a strong theoretical resemblance to the program of the workers' opposition. Similar notions, arguably in the military organization and tactics exemplified by Che Guevara, colored the early years of the communist revolution in Cuba. Most striking was the echo of the Russian opposition in the so-called, quote, cultural revolution, end quote, in communist China in the 1960s, including the introduction of communes, the concepts of proletarian culture and participatory democracy, and radical egalitarianism. I'd be kind of cautious about saying there was some kind of parallel between left communists and of the Russian Revolution and the so-called cultural revolution in communist China. Yeah, it seems like a better thing to compare them to would be to say the workers' councils in Hungary in 1956 or the labor movement in Poland. That seems more apt than comparing them to the Cultural Revolution. Violent anti-intellectual and anti-expert purges in China included the idea broached by the workers' opposition of subjecting officials and specialists to obligatory manual labor. Finally, a related spirit of anti-managerialism distinguished the wave of student protest movements in Europe and the Americas in 1968. In none of these instances, however, was the parallel with the Russian opposition acknowledged. The history of the early left opposition still has relevance after the collapse of the Soviet regime, even though post-communist thinking in Russia ignores it almost completely. It puts the Russian Revolution in a broader perspective, demonstrating that the communist movement was not initially monolithic, and that there were alternative hopes and intentions, however impractical. The same sense of an alternative, of a higher social ideal, if not precisely the utopianism of 1917 to 1921, could potentially play an important role in the reinvigoration of public life in Russia and other former Soviet republics under post-communist conditions. Thanks for listening.